This is the last lecture for Unit 12, so let me start with some information on the unit test. I'm not revising the Unit 12 test review podcasts, but I wanted to warn you that we've made an important change. The test review says that you will choose between two essays, but instead we've set up the test so that Moodle will choose for you. You will get one of two essays randomly assigned. One of the two essays deals with this work, which we'll look at later in this lecture. It's a pretty straightforward question, but you need to know which important events in Mexican history the painting depicts, or at least some of them, what Diego Rivera was trying to say about his country's history, who was his audience, and how they responded, and most importantly, why his audience responded that way. So take careful notes when we get there, okay? Your second choice is an attribution question, and I'm giving you a huge help by showing you the work in advance. I don't think this is actually a tough attribution, but as always with this kind of question, you will have to give two identifiers for the required work by the same artist. One of those really has to be the artist, since this is an attribution question. You also need to justify your attribution with both specific visual evidence from both works. And finally, this is the most important and the trickiest part, you have to talk about how the works demonstrate the artist's ongoing experimentation with form, using landscapes as a means of experimentation. Now, I talked about all this in my podcast about this artist, but it's not an easy question. Really, neither of these questions is easy, so come prepared. You will not be able to use your notes or workbook on the essay test. On to art in North America during the first half of the 20th century. By the early 20th century, America was joining the art world, although it would achieve much greater prominence after World War II, when New York City replaced Paris as the epicenter of modern art. This rather gritty painting of tenement dwellers in New York City, I love the title, is an example of the Ashcan School. These were realist painters who wanted Americans to confront poverty and then do something about it. This is not a required image, but it's an important and interesting American art movement. Another important early 20th century movement in literature, art, and most of all music is the Harlem Renaissance, led by African Americans such as Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Zora Neale Hurston. Aaron Douglas was a Harlem Renaissance artist who did not make the cut, but I love this work, so I'm sticking in these illustrations from a gospel hymn book. And now we come to the most famous work, or rather series of works, by a Harlem Renaissance artist, although the migration of the Negro was actually produced during the early years of World War II. During and after World War I, millions of African Americans migrated north to find better jobs and to escape legally enforced segregation. Jacob Lawrence chronicled their experiences in a powerful series of paintings. So here are two more panels from the series, and the one on the left is our required work. These paintings are very recognizable, and the College Board may well ask you to do just that. These would be great candidates for an attribution question. What's not included here are the very long captions that Lawrence gave these works. Here is the full title of number 49, our required work. I don't think you have to memorize all this. Migration of the Negro, or Migration of the Negro number 49 should be enough. Let's hear from our next presenter. The majority of Southern blacks migrated to the North filled with optimism about a better future. However, many were disappointed to find that the North had its own brand of discrimination. Black migrants into northern cities were often segregated into the most dilapidated sections of the city, forced to pay high prices for inferior housing, and discriminated against in the workplace. Widespread unrest over these conditions erupted into race riots in the summer of 1919. This panel shows a public dining space in the North. Blacks and whites are divided by that yellow barrier that zigzags through the center of the painting, strong use of line. The yellow dividing line is emphasized further by the tilted tabletops and the chairs situated against the background of the restaurant floor. Tables and chairs are placed to reinforce the diner's sense of separation. So here's a formal analysis of Lawrence's series. It comes from the Phillips Gallery in Washington, D.C., which houses about half of these works. Lawrence's paintings show only essential imagery, flattened angular forms, strong diagonals, and contrasts of light and shadow all contribute to the dynamism of the images. Although Lawrence used a limited selection of colors, he arranged the colors to form focal points to direct the viewer's attention. As the narrative unfolds from image to image, the vantage point, the composition, and the details all change in a manner reminiscent of a film. In some panels, human figures dominate. In others, the setting propels the story. The people are not individualized, rather they represent collective characteristics. Moving on, I was disappointed that Georgia O'Keeffe didn't make the cut. She's famous for her paintings of the Southwest, where she lived for part of the year, and even more famous for her detailed, evocative close-ups of flowers, which some viewers insisted were actually thinly disguised sexual imagery. The artist denied this, by the way, but lots of critics remain unconvinced. Georgia O'Keeffe was discovered by and later married to the most prominent American photographer of the early 20th century, Alfred Stieglitz, and this is probably his most famous photograph, one of our required works. Next presenter, please. So here's what the Met has to say about this work. The steerage began its life as a masterpiece 4 years after its creation, when Stieglitz published it in a 1911 issue of the journal Camera Work, and paired it with a Cubist drawing by Picasso. Stieglitz loved to talk about how Picasso had praised his collage-like dispersal of forms and shifting depths in the steerage. Stieglitz rebelled against abstract, so-called art photography. He believed in straight, unmanipulated photographs that caught some important aspect of real life. But he was a modernist, and one reason that he and subsequent critics loved his photograph is how it captures a variety of geometric shapes. By the way, and you probably heard this already, these migrants were being sent home to Europe. They didn't make the cut at Ellis Island. Here's another famous example of Stieglitz's work. I love the way the photo captures the dust being thrown up by the wind and the horse's hooves. And here's one of his relatively few PG-rated photos of his wife. Now, this work didn't make the cut either, though it's an old College Board favorite. But it's famous and beautiful, so during the Depression, the government sponsored art as part of its relief program, and one of the artists was photographer Dorothea Lange, whose photographs of rural depression would transfix Americans and create more support for government welfare programs. The 1930s also saw the rise of Mexican mural paintings, many of which had strong political content, motivated by the Mexican Revolution that overthrew military rule early in the 20th century. The most famous of the Mexican mural painters was Diego Rivera. This is a reconstructed version of a mural that the Rockefellers hired Rivera to paint for the lobby of Rockefeller Plaza. When Rivera chose to include the Soviet leader Lenin in his mural about progress, the Rockefellers fired him and had the mural destroyed. I've drawn an arrow to the portrait of Lenin and blown it up. Rivera persuaded the Mexican government to let him repaint the mural from photographs on a blank wall at the Palacio de Bellas Artes in Mexico City, where it still exists. Put it on the list. This sweeping portrait of Mexican history and Diego Rivera's present is our required work. So let's hear from our second to last presenter. In this painting, hundreds of characters from 400 years of Mexican history gather for a stroll through Alameda Park, Mexico City's first city park, which was built on the grounds of an ancient Aztec marketplace. Rivera, I've circled him in red below, portrays himself as a child standing against a backdrop of Mexican history. Next to him is his wife, Frida Kahlo, holding a yin and yang symbol representing the duality between the masculine and feminine. But the most striking figure by far is La Catrina, the skeleton. Catrina was a nickname in the early 20th century for an elegant upper-class woman who dressed in European clothing. But printmaker Jose Posada, you see him here tipping his hat, had made a famous print, you see that here as well, depicting her as a skeleton. This was a shout out to what he and Rivera both saw as the corruption of Mexico's elite. So, oops. Didn't know that was going to do that. Moving from left to right, the work begins with the conquest and the colonial period, circled in green. To the right is the 19th century wars of intervention, a reform movement led by Benito Juarez, and the imposition of a French emperor, Maximilian. This complicated period is circled in red. Next came the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, circled in blue, followed by the Revolution of 1910, circled in purple, and finally, on the far right, circled in yellow, we see post-revolutionary Mexico. That is the modern Mexico of Rivera's day. So, here are some close-ups of the conquest and international intervention and reform periods. And here we see a policeman brutally attacking a peasant during the dictatorship, a time when Mexico modernized, but mostly for the benefit of a small upper class. And here are scenes from the Revolution, which included major peasant revolts led by revolutionaries who were both political visionaries and bandits. Note that the revolutionaries get a much more sympathetic treatment. So, I borrowed this complicated PowerPoint from another teacher. Note that Rivera included 3 Mexican presidents, identified here by 3 red triangles. How long will it take this one to build? Okay, sorry about that. And here's another complicated borrowed PowerPoint. With some notable figures, including our old friend Sor Juana. I think these are in your workbook. The figures in the foreground come from the immediate past and represent the different social strata of turn-of-the-century Mexico, the Mexico of Rivera's childhood. So on the left, we see a fashionable woman in red silk and lace, the kind of customer who would buy Rivera's works. Near her, in a yellow dress and ungathered hair, is La Revoltosa, a well-known singer and prostitute. She is defiantly staring down a policeman, hands on hips. And near here, on crutches, is another real-life character from Diego's childhood in the Alameda, a hero of the War of Intervention. Again, the right-hand section of the mural depicts the peasant and popular movements that culminated in the Revolution of 1910. It includes the revolutionary triumvirate, soldier, worker, peasant, who led the revolution. But at the far right, we see post-revolutionary Mexico. Note that it's dominated by skyscrapers, a little hard to make them out. Rivera, in this section, portrays the corruption and collusion of the bourgeois, that is, the wealthy politicians and priests, in another triumvirate, the president, the archbishop, and a businessman from modern-day Mexico. The archbishop's a little hard to make out, so I've circled him in red. When the picture was completed in 1948, a furious fight broke out over one detail, a small historical text dating from the 19th century bearing the words, "God does not exist." The fresco was destined for the dining room of the new Hotel del Prado, but the Archbishop of Mexico, the guy I circled in the previous slide, refused to bless the building until the blasphemy was removed. A protester damaged the painting, and it was subsequently concealed behind a wall for 9 years. Ultimately, Rivera agreed to change the offending inscription, and the hotel displayed the mural again. Later, because of public interest, the mural was transported, wall and all, into the reception hall. And here you see the portion that used to read, "God does not exist." Well, in the middle of the 20th century, Diego Rivera, was much more famous than his wife, Frida Kahlo. That's not true today. Here's a painting of Frida and her famous husband, Diego Rivera. Note how small she makes herself. Admittedly, he was a big guy. Still, I think this painting says something a little disturbing about their relationship, which was often stormy and at one point ended in a divorce that proved to be temporary. Drum rolls, our last work for the unit and our last presenter. Mexican painter Frida Kahlo is usually classed as a surrealist, but her work also includes political commentary. Here we see the artist torn between her two heritages, her Mexican mother and her German father. And here's an old AP question about Frida Kahlo's work. If you have time, I'm hoping you can discuss how you would answer this. There is so much more I could say about Frida Kahlo, but I've run out of time, and Ms. Jacobs knows a lot about this artist, so I'm handing this one over to her. Hope you still have some time.